In chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, Paul begins to speak to the church in Corinth about issues that have become disruptive to their worship times. In 11:2 through 16, Paul says some things that may sound a bit strange to many Christians today regarding headship and head coverings. First, we're going to look at what Paul says about headship in verse 3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Note that in Greek it can also read, the man is the head of a woman. We're going to look at three different ways that people approach this passage. Some understand Paul to be saying that man is the head of the woman in the authoritative sense. Just as Christ is the head or the one with the authority over man, so the husband is the head or the one with authority over the wife. This position is similar to how a CEO is appointed the authority over those in the company. Another approach to this passage understands the word head not in the sense of leadership, but rather as source, like one might refer to the head of a river. This view points to other places in Greek literature where this word appears to be used in this way. This approach understands Paul to be reminding the Corinthian church of the order of creation and their role towards one another. Just like Christ is the source of life for man, so in the creation story, man is the source of life for woman. This view points out that Paul repeats this same idea in verse 8 when he says that woman was made from man. Paul's point is that man and woman are not to be independent from one another, but they each have a role to play in giving life to one another, as he will say in verse 11. A third approach interprets head not as source, nor as a position of authority, but as a position of prominence and recognizable standing. They point out that almost every usage of this Greek word in antiquity was meant in this way. This view says that Paul is not trying to make the point that the husband has authority over his wife, but that, at least in that culture, a husband occupied the position of prominence and was the main face of a family. In the same way, they must remember that Christ is in the position of prominence over the Christian man. In that day and age, in public worship settings, how a woman behaved brought either honor or dishonor to her husband, as he was the more public figure. In the same way, how a man behaved in public worship settings brought honor or dishonor to Christ. What Paul is saying in this passage is that your public actions matter as they either bring honor or dishonor to the one that you represent. In other words, be a good ambassador both for your family and for Christ. In verses 4 and 5, Paul moves from the issue of headship to that of head coverings. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. This passage brings up two other questions. One, do women have to cover their heads when they pray? And likewise, should men have their heads uncovered? And two, are women to have long hair and men to have short hair? What we are essentially asking is, are these timeless instructions for all Christians of all times, or were these cultural issues for that day and not applicable to us today? While there are Christians who understand these as timeless instructions that are still binding on us today, that approach takes a strictly literal application of the passage, which is not really necessary for me to cover. Most Christians, however, in both modern times and through much of church history, have viewed these instructions as cultural instructions for the Corinthian church and not instructions for us today. First of all, nowhere else in Scripture are these instructions commanded for men and women. If these were expected behaviors of all Christian men and women, then surely we could trace them back to some other command or instruction somewhere else in the Bible. But not only does the Bible not command these behaviors, we actually see situations where the opposite of these behaviors is endorsed. When it comes to head coverings, Jewish men, not women, actually covered their heads when they prayed, based on the instructions in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 22, verse 12. Though the ritual laws of the Old Covenant were no longer binding on those under the New Covenant, no doubt many Jewish Christian men would have continued this practice after they became followers of Jesus. Likewise, in Jewish customs, women did not cover their heads when they prayed. In a similar way, long hair for men is not considered disgraceful anywhere else in all the Bible. In fact, for Jews, a man having long hair was a sign of someone who had taken a Nazirite vow, which is a particularly pious thing to do. In this vow, one of the things that they were to avoid was cutting their hair. In the Bible, we see Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist as some of the most noteworthy Nazirites. So, what is Paul addressing here? It sounds like he is addressing customs that were unique to the Corinthian culture. In fact, this seems to be what he says in verse 16. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice or custom, nor do the churches of God. In other words, if someone is contentious in this matter, the other churches do not share this custom. Therefore, do not allow this to be a contentious matter. There are times when we may encounter certain cultural expectations or even worship styles in our churches or communities that we don't particularly like, and yet are not contradictory to God's instructions for us. In these situations, it may be tempting to exert our rights and freedoms. But before we do, we need to ask ourselves a question. As an ambassador of Jesus, is this the best way to honor him or not? Perhaps we should be like Paul, who says in 9 verse 8 earlier in the letter, "Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ."